Welcome, everyone. As today's guest, David Wilcock, writes, we truly are standing on the precipice of a breakthrough event in human history on Earth, where many of us will be able to achieve the greatest of spiritual gifts. David Wilcock is a professional lecturer, filmmaker, and researcher of ancient civilizations, consciousness science, and new paradigms of matter and energy. He is the author of the website DivineCosmos.com, where there are thousands of free pages of scientific and spiritual information about soul growth, ascension, and the evolution of consciousness. In addition, his 2012 Enigma is one of the most popular 2012 videos on YouTube with an astounding over 500,000 views. David is also the subject and co-author of the international bestseller, The Reincarnation of Edgar Cayce, which explores the remarkable similarities between David and Edgar. We are thrilled to welcome David Wilcock to Revelations. David, how are you?
I'm doing great, William. How are you, buddy?
Fantastic. So good to have you on the program. And we're doing this in anticipation of an event that we're doing together in Tempe, Arizona in November, so hoping to kind of lay some groundwork here for what people might expect to see at that event.
Well, I think that bringing your information and my information together is long overdue. It sort of happened at the same venue when we were at the Secrets Conference, and I was noticing a lot of the work that you were doing tying in the work of the Founding Fathers, and a lot of that stuff has still not been disclosed. It's all basically still secretive, but I think when people look at these international groups that are in secrecy, they only tend to think of it as if it's got to be something diabolical and terrible.
Right.
And I really like the positive perspective that you bring in on this, because it does clearly seem that there is knowledge that goes back to a primordial civilization that was highly advanced, and that America was intended to honor the principles of free will, which in my opinion transcends religion, it transcends duality, and it gets back to the idea that ultimately we're all entitled to have the right to do things the way we want to do it. And so I believe that that ideal that was put into the Constitution is a clear part of how we make this transition. In other words, I think that the actual invocation of the constitutional democracy that was created was intended to set the groundwork for this new way of living as a planet that we're now trying to evolve into.
I couldn't agree more, and it points, the artwork, in my view, especially in the Dome of the U.S. Capitol, points us to the stars. And, of course, a lot of your work deals with our galactic ancestors and the energetics not only of our planet and solar system, but the galaxy itself and how it affects the individual. So why don't we bring that aspect in, David? Talk about where we're at, where we're moving into galactically speaking, and how that will influence us as individuals.
Well, you mentioned the Edgar Cayce connection, and I really don't stress that too much. It is interesting to look at the facial similarity and that there's a remarkable astrology similarity. But as you know, William, it's like if I do a whole conference and I don't mention it, I actually feel better.
Right, okay.
So it's not like something I dwell on. But it does provide a major stumbling block when people tell other people about my work. I would highly recommend not to mention that part.
Okay.
But, you can on your show, but in general, if you're trying to tell somebody, hey, I just saw this video by David Wilcock, did you know he was Edgar Cayce reincarnated or something? That's not going to go over very well.
Okay.
But what does go over well is this. What I've tried to do, and what I feel I've done successfully, is to dig through a variety of different scientific studies which have led me to the inescapable conclusion that life is part of the universe in its basic nature. It is not some random Darwinian accident that only happened on this one planet. It's something that's much, much more intrinsic than that. And one of the things I love to talk about in my lectures is this work of Hoyle and Wickramasinghe, where they looked at the galactic dust that's out there and concluded that in order for all the numbers to line up, it had to be 70% hollow on the inside. And they said, well, this doesn't even make any sense. How can you have dust that's 70% hollow on the inside? What would do that? And they spent a long time thinking about this, and eventually what they found out was that If you take bacteria and you freeze dry them, they're 70% hollow on the inside. The numbers were exact. And so what this leads to is the idea. Now remember, freeze-dried bacteria are not alive. They're frozen and lost in space. But what this leads us to is the idea that although the surface of a star is very, very hot, we now know, for example, that you look in nuclear reactors and you see these bacteria that spontaneously start growing inside the reactor, inside volcanoes. It doesn't matter what the temperature is. There's still what they call extremophile bacteria that live in those habitats, and they're perfectly happy to be there. So it would appear that stars, the surface of a star, is much more than just a nuclear reaction. It may actually be that the star itself is totally teeming with life, and as it gives off its dust, it has to be that there's all these bacteria coming out. Because remember, this is 99.9% of all the dust in the galaxy that's tested this way.
Right.
So it's like the whole surface of a star is all living. The whole surface of a planet is alive in different ways. And I think we're at a very, very primitive stage in terms of understanding the universality of the life force that's out there. So then that, by extrapolation, goes into the next big thing that I always talk about, which is the fossil record showing clear signs of evolution in even intervals of time. Now, what I mean by that is that David Rope and James Sepkoski, two paleontologists from the University of Chicago, went through the marine fossil record, and they concocted the most elaborate collection of fossils ever been done. 3,300 different genres, which is the genus part, not even the species, but the genus part. 3,300 different genuses of marine fossils. And this goes all the way back to 542 million years ago, where single-celled organisms finally started to develop into more concrete forms of life that you could see as fossils in the ocean. Mm-hmm. Well, what they found was that there was a repeating cycle where every 26 million years, everything on Earth spontaneously, within a very short number of generations, got a rewrite. And interestingly, some species did not, but other species did. And it would happen in these even intervals of 26 million years. So how do you explain that? My conclusion, based on this and many other pieces of evidence, is that we actually do have zones of energy in the galaxy that determine what the genetic code on any given planet is going to be. And those zones of energy have been measured. They appear as a change in microwave frequency, which most astronomers call redshift. And the fact that redshift varies in these even intervals in every galaxy that's ever been seen where it was looked for is very, very troubling to the mainstream, because their entire education is based on redshift. Their entire way that they measure the cosmos is based on this, and now it turns out it's wrong. But what redshift actually does tell us is where the different densities of energy are, because you're looking at different microwave frequencies. And I also bring in this work of Dr. Harold Aspen, who independently was calculating that the so-called ether would have different thicknesses in it that he said could correspond to different planes of existence. At a certain thickness, you have a certain type of existence in that realm. And when he got the theoretical values for what these planes of existence would look like when they gave off microwave frequencies, down to multiple decimal points of accuracy, they were exactly the same as what we later actually witnessed in the galaxies themselves. And he did not know that going in. He did it by straight-ahead math.
Incredible.
So that, to me, really shows, okay, look, we've found the zones of energy in the galaxy. We know they're there. We've observed them in over 250 other galaxies. We know what they do. We know that they shine off a light that corresponds to planes of existence in a very clearly understandable model by Dr. Harold Aspen. We also know that in even intervals of time, the fossil record suddenly gets a rewrite. If you rewind the tape back to about 65 million years ago, which is when dinosaurs went extinct in the biggest one called the KT event, which is typically associated with an asteroid hit, what you find is that there was a chaotic realignment of the planets in the solar system. This is based on computer modeling where they actually go back and they look at the planets and they find out that right around the time the dinosaurs went extinct, there's some strange thing where no matter how you try to model the orbits of the planets, none of them stay where they were at that time.
Amazing.
There's also very clear evidence that I'll show in our talk regarding the climate change that was occurring before the dinosaurs went extinct, which was quite remarkable. And they say, well, it's got to be a coincidence that there's a climate change and then an asteroid hits the Earth. It can't mean, anything.
Right.
Well, it's not an asteroid. In fact, what it appears to be is that there are changes that happen in the solar system from time to time. They're harmonic changes. They're quite intense. But even the planets playing a little do-si-do and moving around in the solar system doesn't necessarily mean that all life on Earth gets wiped out. And this brings in the ET angle, and this brings in where I'm going with all this stuff, which is that if you can accept that DNA is written into the galaxy, right, that it's everywhere, that there's
permeates the galaxy.
There's bacteria hanging out in space. They're all freeze-dried because they're literally, the stars are constantly spewing out bacteria because that's what's inside. Everything is alive. Everything. So all the dust from the stars is loaded with bacteria. That's why no matter what dust you look at, it's always bacteria. So if you can accept that, and then you can accept that the fossil record is going through these rewrites in even intervals of time, it leads us to the conclusion that when we look at these zones of energy in the galaxy, which have been measured and are correlated with equations directly to planes of existence, there is some sort of intelligence that is determining how the fossil record is evolving. So once you reach that cornerstone, then you got to look at the human body, and you got to say to yourself, is it really only something that happened on this one planet? Or doesn't it seem more likely that we're all marching to this drummer, which is the galaxy,
right?
And when these waves come in, it says, okay, guys, it's time to change clothes. You got to do a new thing now. You got to, maybe the planets move around and all this stuff, but there is something very much more interesting going on than cataclysmic changes. So if you can accept that humans are all over the place, then you can tie in the work of Sergeant Clifford Stone, who I met personally, a whistleblower that was at the Disclosure Project event in 2001 and said on camera, and you can watch this on YouTube in any number of places, that in his work, he was responsible for going to ET crashes and basically being the first contact person to go in there when there were ETs that might still be alive and in great pain. One of the things that happens when you go up to them, apparently, is called entrainment, which means that you feel everything they're feeling. And when he would relive these memories, I was at the closed executive summary briefing, which was the day after the one you can watch on the YouTube. That one was only for members of Congress and VIPs, which I happened to get because I've been on Art Bell and I donated money. But that's basically it. That's all it took. So he actually broke down crying when he relived this process of going up to these people when their ships have been damaged. So the extent to which he had an emotional reaction was so intense that I don't care what anybody says, this guy was not acting, it was not a joke, he was totally for real. And he said that they had given him a field manual in which there was a description of all the different people that were orbiting ships around our airspace, so that if any of them crashed, you knew what you were dealing with. They gave you clear illustrations in line art drawings of what the UFOs looked like, of what the people looked like, their height, their characteristics. But the important part is that there were 57 different varieties of humans and drawings of them in this field manual.
Incredible. And
all 57 were pretty much the same as us.
Wow.
Your
Made
friend
in the image of God.
Yeah, your friend and colleague Whitley, the type that he encountered is the most dissimilar from what we look like out of any of them.
Mm-hmm.
That's as far away from it as you get. And some people have described that type as being like a neonate, where you have a fetal form that's been grown to adulthood, probably without the use of any actual womb. It's like an intravenous, that's not what I meant to say, not
in
intravenous,
vitro,
but
right.
In vitro, right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you think about this, we have very clear, unambiguous evidence that UFOs have appeared over nuclear missile installations around the world. In fact, I actually put together a video in Cincinnati, which we're getting ready to release. I haven't been talking about it because I don't know how long it's going to take to put it out there. But in that video, I cite new evidence that comes from a website called IndiaDaily.com, which is coming out of the Indian government, basically. Mm-hmm. And they have been disclosing and disclosing and disclosing on this website for years. If you go into the technology section, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And this is not, stuff that's like sanctioned by the CIA for disinformation. This is stuff that's on the cutting edge that goes into the idea that time is three-dimensional and how you can manipulate gravity to create a wormhole and all this kind of really interesting stuff that they really don't want us to know. Among other things, there was an article on that IndiaDaily.com website that described how in India and Pakistan, when they were getting ready to go nuclear, they actually had all their equipment jammed, and they couldn't use the nukes. Then they got in touch with China, because remember, BRIC is one of these alliances right now, BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China.
Right.
So they talked to China. Then they find out that China had the same problems with their nukes. China even located them deep underground and still couldn't get them to work. Russia has had the same problem. And, of course, the U.S. has had the same problem, and that brings in all the Disclosure Project witnesses. The conclusion that you have to make here is that anybody who tries to use nuclear weapons is going to be stopped because there is an effort being made to protect the planet as much as possible from these things that are going on. Now, there's a lot of people out there, therefore some of them are nasty. It's not like every ET is a good guy. I do not advocate that, but what I am saying is that there are many, many humans out there. We have been lied to by a targeted disinformation campaign going all the way back to when the Roswell crash happened and immediately thereafter, with all these movies that are psyops, and it's been built up over 60 years now for us to think that if somebody was coming in from another place, that they've got to be these horrifying creatures. But, William, you probably know more about this than me. When you go back to the story of the Founding Fathers, there was this guy that showed up. He just manifested in the room.
Right.
And he was able to do all the Masonic handshakes at the highest level, which, of course, is very easy because he could telepathically read their minds. And he basically said, look, you guys need to do this. You need to sign the Declaration of Independence. You need to man up and be brave enough to make this thing happen. And they had locked all the doors from the inside, and yet here he manifested in the room.
Yeah. David, we have to take a quick break. When we come back, let's bring a little bit more of that Founding Father information in, but let's also talk about the effect of tapping into galactic intelligence. What happens to us as individuals once we recognize the galaxy as a living and sentient being and what we're actually a part of? This is Revelations. We'll be right back.
Have you heard Egypt calling? Now is the time to answer. William Henry has places available for Stargate Egypt 5, his Ultimate Egypt Tour, January 18th to the 30th, 2011. Join a small group on the journey of a lifetime, carefully designed and led by William to focus on ancient Egypt's extraordinary Stargate symbolism and enlightening metaphysics. Enjoy private time in the Great Pyramid and between the paws of the Sphinx. Sail the Nile, experience timeless landscapes, come face to face with the past, and maybe aspects of yourself long forgotten. William Henry's Stargate Egypt tours are affordable 5-star tours and are operated by Abercrombie & Kent, the world's foremost luxury travel company. Discover ancient Egypt. Discover yourself. Both are greater than you ever imagined. For information, visit WilliamHenry.net. That's WilliamHenry.net.
This is Whitley Strieber, and I'm back chatting live with UnknownCountry.com subscribers from 7 to 8 p.m. Pacific Time in the UnknownCountry.com subscriber section. UnknownCountry.com subscriber section. Dreamland, going back all the way to 2004. Hundreds of remarkable special interviews, including things you literally will never hear again, such as the wonderful Lawrence Gardner, who recently passed away, but left a deposit of amazing information in our subscriber section. Don't miss it. UnknownCountry.com. Join us today. Go to the UnknownCountry.com website, click on the subscribe tab, and get started. It is unique in the world. It doesn't cost a whole lot of money, and it is worth a whole lot of your interest and time. You need us, and we need you.
You're listening to the Revelations of William Henry.
This is Revelations. We're continuing with David Wilcock. David's website is divinecosmos.com. David, before the break, we were talking about the Founding Fathers and the mysterious visitor that came. And one of the things that I found most intriguing about studying the symbolism, especially in the dome of the U.S. Capitol, is that it seemed to point to this idea that Earth was a colony, if you will, in a quote-unquote federation of star systems that where these super advanced humans are trying to get us to come online and sort of join the Enlightenment Club. And that's a lot of what your work is about, is bringing the scientific basis of what we are learning today that fills in this galactic picture. So talk about, if you would, the effect on us as individuals and also collectively, if you'd like, of tapping into this galactic intelligence. What does this mean for us as individuals, and how do we more fully tap into this?
Well, I've spoken to people who were working in classified programs, and according to many of them, they describe a process by which there is what they call an IQ spike that starts to happen as you tap into what I call your higher self. Mm-hmm. The IQ spike is literally the result of your mind being merged with an energetic field. We are still living in a reductionist scientific paradigm that is as primitive as the idea that the Earth is the center of the solar system, because we think the brain is the center of the mind, and it's totally wrong.
Right.
The mind is everything. The mind can be increased in its efficacy with ESP work by 400% when you're in the proper alignment with the center of the galaxy. That was proven by Dr. James Spottiswoode. So once you know that, how in the world can you say that all that thinking involves is in your brain? Then you got to blend in Dr. John Lorber, who shows that some people don't even have a brain except for literally a 1 to 2 millimeter thick layer on the interior of the skull, which is otherwise all filled with water. And even though that's all they've got, there are people that have had IQs over 120. One guy graduated from Cambridge University. He appeared to be fine in every way except his head was slightly swollen, but you could shine a flashlight on one side of his head and the whole skull would light up red. Now, his brain was tested further, and it was discovered that 60% of the mass had disappeared, 40% was still there, but it was very, very, very highly compressed against the skull. And then you have to even postulate, okay, well, could the tissue even function in its normal capacity if 40% of the brain mass was smashed down to the size of a slice of bologna? Probably not. So skeptics have attacked this, but believe me, this is in medical literature. In my book, 2012 Enigma, which is coming out next year in May, I actually found other studies of hamster brains where there's a particular type of lab hamster that keeps having this problem with the brain turning into water. And yet they can still use the mice and the hamsters in the experiments. There's no problem with them. They remember things, they breathe, they do everything totally fine. So this is where we start to gauge ourselves based on our cosmic access. We gauge our lives based on the amount of synchronicity that's happening to us. The synchronicity is where we start to see that we are not separate from our environment. And there are so many wild and wonderful examples that happen to people.
Right.
So many incredible examples. I remember just off the top of my head, one of the weirder ones that happened to me was I was driving down the street in Virginia Beach on Atlantic Avenue, and I was listening to a song. I was emotionally enjoying the song, And it had stop time arrangements, which means there's a series of horn hits that would happen, these three rhythmically precise notes that the horns play and the drums play it, and the beat has stopped during that part. It's da-da-da, like that, right?
Uh-huh.
It was actually Phil Collins.
Okay.
And right at the moment that exact part of the song came in, this guy going in the opposite direction on Atlantic Avenue, for whatever reason, hit his horn and went da-da-da. Exactly, I mean, down to a fraction of a second, exactly the same as what was in the music. And so, again, if you have these experiences 20 times, 30 times, 50 times, 500 times, practically every day, it tears away this veil that makes you think that you're this separate entity, that your mind is not in any way interrelated with what's around you. And you start to get back into the idea that if, again, life is being generated within stars, they're actually spewing out bacteria which then get freeze-dried and turn into dust. The planets are alive. There is definitely a Gaia consciousness, and we can get into the pyramid technology and how that works.
Sure.
Because that's another thing I'm going to talk about extensively at our event.
Wonderful.
Once you get into that stuff, what you see is that the Earth has a conscious energy. It can be harnessed. That's what pyramids were built for. And that energy will cause substantial benefits to your level of consciousness, to your health, to the planet. It'll close ozone holes. It'll reduce earthquakes. It'll reduce volcanic activity. All these astonishing things happen as a direct result of harnessing this natural, living, conscious energy. So, you want to get into the physics for a minute. My conclusion is that the gravitational field is the answer. In the mainstream physics models, everybody wants to use electromagnetism. In fact, Einstein tried to make a whole universal model around electromagnetic energy. But nobody's ever really looked at gravity, and that's the big mistake. That's where all the Russian science has to come in. Because the Russian science, if you look at this one guy named Terletsky, he basically is looking at electrical and magnetic, which is electromagnetic. That's the two halves of electromagnetic energy. And Terletsky says, well, in gravity, you got to look at the gravitational force, then you got to look at the spin. So he calls it gravi-spin. Now, the spin field within gravity is where all the magic lies. That's where the consciousness of the universe actually resides. That's where DNA comes from. It's all based on the spin field. Now, in order to understand the spin field, you got to understand what gravity actually is. Gravity is the result of the Earth being fed by an energy field. In other words, the molecules in the Earth are being fed by an energy that's flowing into the Earth, and we get caught up in that flow, and it pushes us down. That's actually what's causing gravity. Another really interesting thing about gravity is, unlike electromagnetism, which can be shielded by lead, you don't ever shield gravity. The lead is going to hold onto your chest just as well in the X-ray chair as anything else. There's nothing that we see that's hovering around us. So gravity affects everything because every molecule is being fed by gravity. And again, I'm not going out on a limb here. There's a variety of really good physics breakthroughs that are happening that show that gravity is the key to understanding the quantum level, what's happening in the atom. One guy is Nassim Haramein. In fact, he just won a physics prize in Belgium for coming to the conclusion that gravity, that the physics around a so-called black hole, which he does not say is a black hole, he says that actually every star has what you could consider a black hole on the inside, but then what you could call a white hole on the outside, and that's actually the surface of the star. But nonetheless, this physics of the Schwarzschild radius, which is basically the event horizon around a black hole, is exactly the same as the physics around a proton in an atom.
Interesting.
So you're looking at the same thing. So if it's happening on one level, if gravitation is what's actually causing one atom to happen, then it's also what's causing the whole planet to happen. And there's a variety of data that shows that this field is fluid-like, and it actually behaves like a fluid, but the part that really stumps our brain is that it behaves like a fluid outside of our physical reality. We only see the results of this fluid, similar to the idea that if you stir up a bunch of sugar in water, drop a string in it, you don't see rock candy form on the string until the crystals start growing, and then they have to grow into existence.
Right.
So physical matter is like that. Physical matter is something that grows into existence. And I've gotten way off track on accessing your higher self and everything I wanted to be going into when I answered your question, but all this stuff is background. It's all relevant because ultimately this gravitational flow that's going into every atom and going into the Earth, it doesn't just make things exist on a mundane level. It's actually the energy of mind. And ultimately what you want to do is what all of the ancient Tibetan Buddhists and all the great spiritual teachers seem to keep telling us over and over again, and that is you have a duality in your being. You have a mind that is based on the body. It's looking out for the needs of the body. It's the ego. And then you have a mind that is based on the spirit, which is directly connected to the field, in which the thoughts that come into your mind, like in the case of synchronicity, how is it that you end up making all these turns in your car, and you get an odometer lineup where you get 333 on your odometer right as you arrive at your destination. That one happens to me all the time. Or the clock synchronicity, where you just so happen to get the inspiration to look up from what you're doing, you see the clock and it says 11:11, or it says 4:44, or 12:12, or 3:33, or anything like that. These are not random happenstance events. These are events that imbue meaning. And as people always ask me, how do I interpret these synchronicities? The answer is, in my opinion, look at what you were thinking about right before it happened. And that will be the message. The message is basically saying whatever you were just thinking about is a good thing. Keep going in that direction. And so it happens to me so often that if it doesn't happen, I feel like I'm not in my alignment, something's off. So again, the key to the meditative practice is subduing this part of ourselves that is insecure, needs to be feeling some sort of pride, which means we're building ourselves up at the expense of others. We're looking out for our own interests. We're trying to preserve and protect the body and make the body as comfortable as possible, which means we want money, which means in some cases we feel the need to manipulate people to get that money. All of that stuff, all that preoccupation with the need of the body, is what most people call the ego, which is really not a very fair term because obviously you can't transcend your own personality. You need to have an ego to interact with the world. But it's really more like the undeveloped self that most people are living in. And as you get more developed, here's what really happens, and people really don't seem to get this. We live in a drug-taking culture, and as a result of that, we have ready availability of alcohol. You can pound 7 shots in a row, and the next thing you know, if you try to get up from the table to go to the bathroom, you're going to have a very hard time walking. As a result, we now also think that if we're going to have psychic information, that it's literally like we walk out of our house, the clouds rip open, light streams down, beams into our third eye, and we hear this thundering voice of God that makes the trees almost blow over.
Right.
It doesn't work like that.
No, it doesn't.
It's a still, small voice. Mm-hmm. It's quiet, it's always there, and it just involves tuning in. And I think that's the gist of what you were asking me.
Yeah, and it seems that our higher self, more than anything perhaps, just wants us to wake up from the matrix and then ultimately to escape from the matrix. And that's where I'd like to go. We've just got a couple minutes left in this segment, David, and then we'll have a whole other half hour to get into this whole idea of transfiguration and light body activation.
Excellent.
Because it seems like, isn't that the direction the higher self is trying to get us to go?
Absolutely. In order to understand what the higher self is and why that question is so significant, we have to get back to the core metaphysical cosmology, what I call ageless wisdom. That means everybody who starts to get enlightened, they might have variations on it, but they're all going to come up with basically the same information. Unfortunately, we have a tendency to turn those seekers into religions, and we worship their particular access pathway as if it was the only way to access it. But everybody basically comes up with the same thing, and you can get it contorted into holy war, but the idea is love. And it's basically the intrinsic aspect of the universe. It's the way that the universe always has been. It's an awareness that actually created everything there is. It all clusters back down to the idea that before there were galaxies, before there were stars, before there were planets, before there were sentient life forms, there was empty awareness, just a pure consciousness, which then decided of its own free will to break itself off into separate units, which are the primordial galaxies that the universe was formed from. And the greatest gift that this original creator gave us was to allow each of these galaxies to have the complete free will to do whatever the heck it wanted. And then those galaxies, in turn, are allowed to become creators, and they, in turn, give stars and planets, and then the people on those planets, the free will to do whatever the heck they wanted. So this is the big game, but the secret is that we're all part of this one identity. There's actually no separation at all. And so the game is that we move through separation and reacquaint ourselves with who we really are and the ethical and moral and spiritual principles involved in that identity. And that's what all of this universe was created for, is to lead us through this game where in the beginning we're doubting Thomas, we're skeptical, we don't like what's happening, we say, this sucks. And over time we say, it really does feel better to forgive people, to love people, to embrace, to go across the aisle and find a way that we can all work together because we're all, again, becoming one once more. And that's what I really think this is all about. And so, yes, as you acquaint yourself with your higher self, it appears to be some part of yourself millions of years more evolved than you are that lives in the future, that does not exist in linear time, and is trying to guide you back to this understanding of who and what you really are. And so we actually have a very jarring experience here because the physical illusion is built to take us to that realization regardless of the expenses that are incurred on the physical body, which can include catastrophic injury and even death. So we actually have a game with high stakes. A lot of people really don't like that. When they face up to it, they don't like the cosmic plan. So one of the things we have to do is forgive ourselves as being God for the way that this game is set up and for how ridiculous